This morning. I thank you especially for applauding my marriage. I think it's the best part of that list of things, too. Cheryl and I went to a wedding. I think it was a couple of months ago now. We were joining the rest of my family for a family friend who was getting married down by Sequoia National Park. And the wedding was, fine. It was like other weddings, dancing and everything. But the next day, on our way back, we decided we would drive through Sequoia National Park just to see. We didn't have a lot of time, but we thought we will just take the time we have and we'll go there. And we drove in, we're caravanning, all these different cars, my parents, my sister, our car. We drove in, we stopped at the visitor station, the first one that we came to. It might have been partly for the bathrooms, but it was also partly to get kind of a handle on what we should see. If we only have a little time, what should we see? And we're browsing around, we're looking at the gift shop a little bit, we're, taking in, deciding where we should go. And I overheard another set of visitors who were talking to one of the rangers. And a gentleman was standing there and he had a postcard in his hand. And he had come the other direction through the park, so he had been to see some of the trees before he got to this visitor center, and he was saying, "Look at this picture. I went to see this tree, and it doesn't look like that now." Now, this is a black and white picture on his postcard. It's a picture from the 1920s. From almost 100 years ago. He's holding this postcard and he's saying, "Look at this limb. It's not even there." He said, "What are you guys doing here if you're not maintaining things?" I thought the ranger handled it very well, probably better than I would have. He kind of collected himself a little and he said, "It's a living tree." And the gentleman with the postcard was still a little blustery, and the ranger said, "Nothing alive stays the same. It's a living tree, and nothing alive stays the same." The gentleman asked a couple more questions after that, and the ranger started to say, if you wanted to see exactly what a sequoia looked like in 1920, whatever, you have the postcard. And he said, actually, we have some specimens that you could look at. You could see exactly the same as how they were in 1925 because we cut them down. So they stopped growing. They cut down these enormous trees, a whole bunch of them. They shipped them across the country for world's fairs and exhibitions so that people on the East Coast, lacking as they are in enormous trees that we are blessed with around here, could look at them and say, "That's not real. I don't believe in that." They could take them over there. But if we want it to stay exactly the same, we have to kill it. Because nothing alive stays the same. I had some sympathy for the guy with the postcard, though. You get your expectations, what things are going to be like. I'm not sure why the picture he had was one of those original to the park pictures, back when we started thinking about conservation. But he's missing this picture, and he's saying it's not like that now. I was struck by the person in that interaction who was not sad about the change, though. That was the ranger, who's there day in and day out, tending and protecting, probably primarily trying to get the rest of us to not walk over the root system so much as to prevent that tree from continuing to change and grow by killing it, keeping the rest of us far enough back that the tree can become what it is going to become. And sometimes that means that limbs that were in the picture fall right off. And the tree continues to thrive and grow and inspire. I felt like sequoias made me feel a bit like an ant. They're so massive, Redwoods make me feel short. But sequoias made me feel miniature. Like the whole scale of a regular tree was just blown up. It was really quite something. In a way, I think it helped me feel right-sized in this world. It's easy as a human among all these other creatures to get an idea of ourselves as primary here. We have these particular gifts and skills that are somewhat outsized, and we can get a picture of ourselves as very important. And I'm not saying that we're not important, but sometimes it's helpful to stand in the presence of something that big and just shrink a little. Nothing alive stays the same. There's something so human in that question that man said. This isn't the same. It has changed. What is there in this world that I can count on if even the sequoias are not like they looked like in the postcard? Where can I place my hope? Where can I rest from all of this relentless change? I am young in this world, and even I feel like things are changing at a breakneck speed. Every time you get used to one piece of technology, it's outdated, and people say, I can't believe you're carrying that anymore. Look at that antique you have there. Things change so quickly. The rules are changing all the time. Social norms change. Things come and things go. We're always trying to adapt. I sometimes remind myself that we are not the only generation in the world that feels like things are changing so fast. There have been many generations before us where people have wrestled with how fast things are changing. Not all of them, but some of them. We have ancestors to look to. How to react, how to adapt. And one of those time frames when things were changing quite fast was actually when Jesus was around, walking on the earth with his own 2 feet, and especially right afterwards when Paul was writing these letters. I have a lot of love for Paul, even though he kind of gets a bad reputation because his words get taken to mean various negative things. I admire Paul because he was wrong so much. I think it's kind of encouraging. I think those letters are so good because he's so sincere, and then he contradicts himself in the next one. People ask him these questions. What should we do? Should we get married? They all think Jesus is coming back next Tuesday. And he says, no, don't get married. I mean, if you're married, stay married, but if you're not married, don't get married. It's fine. He's coming back right away. And then you see the next letter where he says, well, he's not coming back right now. Might be a little later. Get married if you want to. There's probably no harm. He's setting up these churches, and he's looking to each of them. Part of why I think the letters are so inconsistent is they're not to the same group. Different churches need different messages. Some churches are having conflict, and they need Paul to say, you guys, knock it off. Listen to each other. Some churches, the rich people are hoarding their resources, and they're not sharing, and those folks need to hear from Paul. Open your fists, guys. You're not getting the message here. Some churches need encouragement to talk to their neighbors. Some churches need a little encouragement to become a community. Paul is looking with the heart of a pastor at each of those communities individually with their separate gifts, all members of this one body, and encouraging them in the parts where he believes they need to be encouraged. Whether or not he was right every time, at least he's trying. I admire that too. He doesn't hesitate to jump right in there. He also doesn't hesitate to include lots of details about things. He's very specific. He really wants to be present to all these people at once. The other thing that I find really inspiring about Paul is that none of these churches that he planted are still there. Paul, I went to a church planting workshop a while back, and people were talking about Paul as if he were maybe Jesus, the ultimate church planter. He's out seeding these communities all over the place. And at the end of the workshop, one of the presenters said, now keep in mind, these churches did not fail, but they're not there now. These churches did not fail, but they're not there now. Things change because they are not monuments. They're part of a living body, and nothing alive stays the same. People from those churches went to other places, and they started new things, and this movement of people whose lives were transformed and whose hearts were touched by this encounter with the living Christ in these churches. They went other places, and they started their own, and they told other people about it, and nothing stayed exactly the same because it's alive, and it's still alive. I think sometimes there's this hope that if we could just figure out exactly how church should be, if we just get it exactly right, then we can stop changing it. If we just figure out what works perfectly, the perfect council structure, the perfect set of committees, the perfect children's program with the perfect curriculum, the perfect orientation of the choir, the perfect set of ministers in what exactly their configuration should be. If we just figure out exactly right, and maybe we'll be the ones to do it in this configuration, we'll get it exactly right, and then we can stop changing anything. And we can take a break, right? Because change is hard. Change is tiring. We get so tired of things shifting all the time. And every time you come in saying, wait, hold on, I thought it was like that, and now it's like this. I thought we were doing it this one way, and now we're doing it this other way. I loved that program, and we're not doing it anymore. Things change, and we're tired. We start looking for a place to rest. I think this is part of why the image of this kind of unchanging God is so compelling to us, so restful. To think about a God who stays the same, one thing in the world that we can count on, that we can say, okay, if everything else changes, there's one still point. And we know where it is. We have all of this sort of unchanging, unfailing, faithful forever. And I wouldn't say that any of that is wrong, but I'm also kind of inspired that God maybe understands a little bit about this. If you had the pleasure to be here last week, and you got to hear about the story of Jesus meeting this woman with a daughter who is beset by demons in some way. Who knows what's going on with the daughter? But the woman came to Jesus and said, I have this issue. I need help. Help me. And Jesus, understanding his own vocation somewhat in a more limited way, said, I'm not for that. I'm sorry, but that's not my mandate. And she said, think again. Look again, pal. I'm here and we need this. Think again. Take another run through that in your mind and just see. She approached it sideways a little bit, and Jesus changed his mind. Jesus recognized that his mandate was bigger than he thought, that something had to shift. Even God, even the Holy One, can learn and can grow, and even Jesus probably was a little bit tired from that. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to think about, what does this mean now? But nothing alive stays the same, and we know that Jesus, as part of us, was alive and is alive. And nothing alive stays the same. We are always growing. We are always thinking about what comes next, where we've been and where we're headed. I read a really interesting study this week that asked people to think about how much they have changed. It asked them to look back, and the question was, how much have you changed in the last 10 years? What has shifted? How much have your values changed, your priorities, your skills? And people said, oh, so much. So much has changed in the last 10 years. People reported a lot of change. And then the follow-up question was, how much do you think you'll change in the next 10 years? And people said, oh, not at all. I changed so much in the last 10 years, but now I'm here. I've arrived at my final self. This is good. Change is tiring, and I don't think I need to keep doing it, so much in the last 10 years, and not at all in the next 10. If it's true for individuals and our individual bodies, it is true for us as a church. In congregations, in denominations, in the whole church worldwide, in our communities, how much have we changed in the last 10 years? What has shifted? Where are our priorities? How have we looked out at the community around us and heard them when they said, think again? Look again. Maybe your call is to this thing that you're not doing yet. A lot can change. And when somebody shows up and says to us, think again, ask that question, we are responsive to our communities. If we're following Jesus, we're ready to hear, even when we think we have a pretty good idea of ourselves, who we are, and where we're going. We're ready to hear someone come from the outside and say, think again. I need you. I need you even if you don't think you're for me. I need you even if you're focused on this other thing. And to hear that woman's voice in that need, and like Jesus, to respond and say, oh, maybe. Oh, what would it look like? Oh, how might we be being called to change? Who are we becoming? There's a physics principle that I really enjoy when thinking about this. Many of you will probably know more about this than I do. I have only a cursory and somewhat metaphorical understanding. But I like to think about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle with this kind of thing. That if something is moving as we are, if something is changing as we are, you can zoom in very closely and pinpoint exactly where it is. But the closer you zoom in, the less you know about what the process is of where it's going. Or you can get a pretty good picture of where it's going and how, but you lose your specificity on where it is in the instant. You have to choose which you can know more about. And to me, because we are alive as a church, as the body of Christ, as God's people, as people following some divine inspiration, because we are alive, it's more interesting to ask the question of where we are headed. Who are we becoming? Rather than getting too bogged down with who we are right now. Who are we becoming? We are becoming the church for this spot, in this time, in this season. We are becoming the body of Christ that can respond to the people around us now and going forward. Hopefully, we are becoming more discerning and more faithful. Hopefully, we are becoming more joyful. Hopefully, we are becoming people with bigger imaginations. But it's more important to me to ask the question, who are we becoming? Where are we headed? Rather than get too stuck with who we are right this second. Paul's churches were so different from each other. They were so responsive, and yet they were one thing together. They were one community across all of this geographical distance, which was somewhat more significant back then when you had to send letters that could take weeks to get from place to place. They still managed, across all their diversity, to be one community together. The community for that time, for that season of change, for people wrestling with very complicated politics, not that we know anything about that, for people trying to figure out what it is like to live in a place with deep divides between people who have way more than they need and people who have way less. People who were wrestling with being followers of Christ in a militarized setting. They were dealing with soldiers, they were dealing with occupiers, they were dealing with all of these changes, cultures coming together and mixing. All of these things we also have the privilege of wrestling with. And when Paul says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds," I think part of what he is saying is, nothing alive stays the same. Be transformed. Don't settle. Don't be still here, but continue to be open to what God is calling into being next, what God is already bringing to fruition in our midst. And don't hesitate, as Mary Oliver said, to experience the joy of those transitions, the joy of setting down what has had its season and is no longer living, the joy of letting a dead branch, even a big one, fall to the ground, even if the picture looks different, so that what is living can thrive. What I learned about those trees is that sometimes limbs get too heavy. Sometimes, even while it's still a little bit alive, it gets too heavy. And the tree just lets it go. The tree says, "That's no longer serving and I don't need it." This is a little bit dangerous in a national park. Those are big limbs. But sometimes the tree just lets them go. And the ranger who is there, present and in it, working in partnership with all of these majestic beings, isn't afraid of that change. It's only those who just stop by, who notice that big gap and aren't there to see the transformation. So I hope for us that we are all in it, that we are there as rangers and not as visitors in this particular place, that we are all co-workers in this project of figuring out what God is doing next year, and that we are ready to hear the blessing of those around us in the community who help us see what our vocation is in this next season. May it be so.